Chapter 7. The Conclusion. We had all been summoned to appear before the magistrates on Thursday, but when the day arrived, our testimony was no longer needed. A higher judge had taken the case into his own hands. Jefferson Hope had been called before a tribunal where absolute justice would be served. On the very night after his arrest, his aneurysm burst. He was found the next morning stretched out on the floor of his cell with a peaceful smile on his face, as if in his final moments he could look back on a life of purpose and a mission successfully completed. "Gregson and Lestrade will be furious about his death," Holmes remarked the next evening as we discussed the news. "What happens to their big publicity stunt now?" "I don't see that they had much to do with his capture anyway," I replied. "What you actually do in this world is of no importance," Holmes returned bitterly. "The only question is, what can you make people believe you have done? Never mind," he added more brightly after a moment. "I wouldn't have missed this investigation for anything. It was an excellent case, simple as it was. It had several very instructive points." "Simple?" I exclaimed. "Well, it really can't be described any other way," Holmes said, smiling at my surprise. "The proof of its simplicity is that, with only a few basic deductions, I was able to identify the criminal within 3 days." "That is true," I admitted. "I've told you before, what seems extraordinary is usually a guide rather than a hindrance. The key to solving a problem like this is the ability to reason backward. It's a very useful skill and quite easy, yet people rarely practice it. In everyday life, it's more functional to reason forward, so the analytical method is neglected. For every person who can reason analytically, there are 50 who can only reason synthetically." "I confess," I said, "I'm not quite following you." "I didn't expect you would. Let me try to be clearer. If you describe a chain of events to most people, they can tell you what the result will be. They can put the events together and predict the future. However, there are very few people who, if given only the result, can evolve from their own consciousness the steps that led up to it. This is what I mean by reasoning backward or analytically." "I understand now," I said. "This was a case where you were given the result, a corpse, and had to find everything else. Let me show you my train of thought." I approached the house on foot with a blank mind. I began by examining the road, where I saw clear cab tracks. I confirmed it was a cab, rather than a private carriage, by the narrow gauge of the wheels. A standard London growler is significantly narrower than a gentleman's brougham. That was the first clue. Then I walked down the garden path. To you, it looked like a mess of trampled slush, but to my eyes, every mark had a meaning. The art of tracing footsteps is the most important, yet most neglected branch of detective science. I saw the heavy boots of the constables, but I also saw the tracks of the 2 men who had arrived first. It was easy to tell they were there first, because the later tracks overlapped and blurred the originals. This told me there were 2 visitors, one very tall, judging by his stride, and one fashionably dressed, judging by the small, elegant boot prints. Inside the house, the body confirmed my inference. The well-booted man was the victim. Therefore, the tall one was the killer. There were no wounds, but the look of terror on the dead man's face told me he had seen death coming. People who die of natural causes like heart disease never look that agitated. When I smelled the dead man's lips, I detected a slightly sour odor, the sign of poison. I concluded it was forced upon him because of the combined look of hatred and fear on his face. By the process of elimination, no other hypothesis fit the facts. Then came the motive. It wasn't robbery. Was it politics or a woman? Political assassins strike and flee. This murder was deliberate and slow. The killer had stayed in the room for some time. It was a personal vendetta. The word Rach on the wall was too obvious a red herring. But when the wedding ring was found, the case was closed. The murderer had used it to remind his victim of a woman. I then examined the room more closely, confirming the killer's height and identifying the Trichinopoly cigar and his long fingernails. Since there was no struggle, I deduced the blood on the floor had come from the murderer's nose during his excitement. This suggested a robust, ruddy-faced man. After leaving the house, I did what the police neglected. I telegraphed Cleveland about Enoch Drebber's marriage. The reply was the final link. Drebber had once applied for legal protection against a romantic rival named Jefferson Hope, who was currently in Europe. I knew the man who entered the house with Drebber had to be the cab driver. The horse's tracks showed it had wandered aimlessly, which only happens if the driver is absent. And why would a killer commit a crime in front of a third-party witness? To follow someone through London without suspicion, there is no better disguise than a cab driver. I assumed he was still working as a driver to avoid suspicion. I sent my street Arab scouts to every cab owner in London until they found him. The rest you know. The murder of Stangerson was a tragedy I couldn't prevent, but it gave me the pills I had already suspected existed. It was a perfect logical chain. "It's wonderful!" I cried. "You deserve public recognition. You should publish the case. If you won't, I will." "Do as you like, Doctor," Holmes said, handing me a newspaper. "But look at this." It was the Echo. The article claimed the public had been deprived of a sensational treat by the death of Jefferson Hope. It mentioned that the crime was the result of an old Mormon feud, and concluded, "The credit for this smart capture belongs entirely to the well-known Scotland Yard officials, Lestrade and Gregson. The man was apprehended in the rooms of a certain Mr. Sherlock Holmes, an amateur who has shown some talent and who, with such instructors, may one day reach their level of skill." Holmes laughed. "Didn't I tell you? That's the result of our study in Scarlet, to get those two a testimonial." "Never mind," I replied. "I have the facts in my journal, and the world shall know the truth. In the meantime, be satisfied with the knowledge of your success